across the fence, removing Confederate monuments from public places and what those actions say about America's past, present, and future. Good afternoon, and thanks for joining us. I'm Judy Simpson. One of the issues that sparked protests and violence in Charlottesville, Virginia last month was the removal of the statue of Robert E. Lee, the commander of the Confederate Army. Some see the Confederate statues as a sign of heritage, while others see symbols of hate. Well, a few weeks before the violence in Charlottesville, I spoke with Civil War historian Howard Coffin. Howard and I began our conversation talking about Civil War memorials and when they were built.
Well, there was a spate of building monuments right after the war, and then that eased off, and there were about 20 years, very few were put up. And then as the war faded a little bit into memory, the veterans began to remember and began building them again. Here in Vermont, it started right after the war, a few towns who had lost very heavily in the war.
Which towns were those?
The first one was at Derby Line. 53 men died from Derby Line. And then Rochester was early, Peacham early, heavy losses, and Plymouth.
So other than honoring soldiers who died, what do the monuments mean to a community?
Well, of course, after the Civil War, the losses were tremendous, and the people were struggling to find some way to express their grief, that sense of loss. There was some sense, of course, in the North of bragging about the victory. In the South, particularly, the sense of loss, and then as the myth of the lost cause began to develop, it all tied in with that.
And so give us a sense of how many monuments to Confederate soldiers there are in the South.
You know, I don't know, but I've been throughout the South, and they are everywhere. There are thousands of them. And most of them fall into that usual pattern of a Confederate soldier on a pedestal on the village green. Many of them, incidentally, are made of Vermont stone, particularly Berry granite. These were mass-produced and sold, and then you put the wording on you wanted for the local history.
So in the case of New Orleans, who took down several of these statues, what's being gained, but what's also being lost?
Increasingly, in many parts of the South, are becoming much less white. New Orleans, I now believe, has a majority of black voters in the city. The history of New Orleans and the Civil War, of racism, of slavery, is very, very bad. There were riots right after the Civil War, race riots. There were slave markets in New Orleans, and the black residents of that town now have the political power to vote these things out, and you can't blame them. When the Civil War begins, 4 million people are enslaved in this country. It was horrible the way they were treated. It's our great national shame. And so as blacks today rise up against this history, they can't be blamed, and certainly many more monuments are doomed.
So some feel that anything Confederate is a memorial to white supremacy.
Absolutely, yes. You know, Ulysses Grant at Appomattox watched Robert E. Lee ride away from the surrender negotiations, and Grant said that he felt pity for Lee and for his defeated soldiers, but he added to that that no men ever fought for a worse cause than the Confederates. Yes, the war was about keeping slavery alive.
So as we've seen in your programs on Vermonters in the Civil War, there are Confederate memorials on battlefields. How are these different from where other Confederate memorials stand?
It's going to be an interesting test down the years to see what's going to be done about the battlefield memorials. My guess is that they will stay because they are part of history. Gettysburg, there are, I think, about 1,400 memorials. Many of them, very interestingly, are great pieces of sculpture.
Right.
My favorite monument at Gettysburg is the North Carolina monument, which was sculpted by Gutzon Borglum, who did Mount Rushmore. And it is a magnificent depiction of 4 Confederate soldiers just starting across the field where Pickett's charge took place. It's very beautifully sculpted. One of the things I love about it is that in 1963, April of 1963, John F. Kennedy was so impressed by it that he got out of his car during a tour of the battlefield and walked over to admire it.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that is there a concern that this issue of removing memorials will ever come up at Gettysburg?
Oh, I'm sure there's going to be a fight over some of those memorials at Gettysburg. The Mississippi Memorial is particularly cruel, showing one soldier clubbing another one. But I think most of them will be protected as pieces of history, and they do help in the understanding of the battle. The first big memorial, incidentally, the first big state memorial at Gettysburg was erected by the state of Vermont with General George Stannard on top, who defeated Pickett's charge.
Well, when a monument to the Confederacy comes down, what should go up in its place?
That's a very interesting question. I think ideally something honoring those who suffered in slavery. In the North, there should be monuments up here to black soldiers. There are almost none. Mm-hmm. More blacks served per capita from Vermont than white men in the Civil War. We have no monuments here in the state to blacks. In the South, well, for instance, Bowling Green in Virginia, that's the first Civil War memorial I ever saw. It's on the village green. It's a Confederate soldier standing there. I know that in Bowling Green, the Vermont sharpshooters set free hundreds of slaves who were jammed into a jail in there in 1864. Wouldn't it be nice to see a monument to the Vermont sharpshooters or to those slaves that were freed? But that, of course, is never going to happen in a southern town.
Is it dangerous, do you think, to erase history?
There are always dangers when you deal with erasing history, lest we forget. But there are so many of these things that as black majorities build through the South and more of these monuments are taken down, there's still going to be plenty of them.
Mm-hmm. But I think moving forward, don't you think it's important to say that this is the past, obviously, but what are we going to do about the future? What are we going to do about the present? What can we add to what's already there to reflect who we are today?
I suppose it's important to memorialize what the Civil War brought about. Mm-hmm. It brought about, of course, we were on the path to setting this country right with Reconstruction, but that was destroyed, and Jim Crow took its place, and then it took Martin Luther King and the Kennedys and to bring the Civil Rights Movement on. That, memorialize that, mm-hmm. Set us in the right direction. There are all kinds of opportunities for that.
So how do Southern historians that you know reckon with the history of the Confederacy in the South today?
Well, Shelby Foote I knew, and Shelby Foote quite simply said that most Confederate soldiers did not own slaves, and they were fighting because you are down here, is the way Shelby Foote put it. But that skirts the issue of the fact that they were fighting for a cause that defended slavery. And of course, one of the big myths about the Civil War is, as the Southerners say, well, we were going to end slavery anyway. Well, that's not true. Slavery was growing because it was expanding westward. That's what the war was about. And the Southerners wanted to take slaves west to work new cotton fields, to work the mines in the West. No, it was on the increase.
And so, as an historian who studies Vermont's history in the Civil War, what do these monuments mean to you, these Confederate monuments?
Well, of course, it's always interesting to see what these generals look like.
Right. And
some of the statuary is magnificent. the statues help you, particularly if you give tours, as I do, to explain the positioning of the armies where various generals had their troops. And there are at Gettysburg, Lee's statue is on the spot where he watched Pickett's charge. That's very helpful in explaining the charge because you can see it a mile away across the valley. It's huge. At Antietam, perhaps my favorite monument of all of them is a statue called Old Simon, which is a Union soldier 45 feet high. It's like one of those great Russian war memorials that memorializes the 12,000 Union soldiers who became casualties there. But it stands in the cemetery on the hill where the Confederates had their headquarters, and it helps to see from a distance that key position. But then when you stand there in that cemetery where 4,000 Union soldiers are buried, it just towers over you, and it just gets at the tremendous loss of this huge, long war.
Well, that brings up an interesting point. It just gives, these monuments give a sense of place. When you go visit other places in the country to see these monuments, to read about them, it gives you a sense of place and history other than just enjoying a vacation.
Oh yes, absolutely. And they, in a sense, they do bring back the human factors of the battle, the human elements, and all of these men who died. But there are plenty of them, and there are many other things about the Civil War and its aspects today that can be memorialized.
Mm-hmm. And so how much of this discussion around memorials is about America and not just North and South?
America today is North and South. We talk about the red and the blue states. Well, the line that divides them really runs along the line that divided the North and South at the time of the Civil War. When you talk about America today, you're talking about a country that is still divided North and South, still divided by the Civil War. There's reminders, certainly, in any Civil War history that this country has a long, long way to go in finally bringing this Civil War to a close, bringing racism to a close, bringing the divisions that were brought about by the Civil War to a close. The politics of the two regions are hugely different, and that evolves from the Civil War. We've got to make some progressive strides in this country, or we're never going to be together and never going to intelligently solve the great problems that face this country, from health care to racism, and you can go on and on.
What do you think would be a good first step from here on out?
A good first step from here on out would be for the people of this country to stop living the myths of America and face up to the reality of America and elect a president that doesn't sell him or herself on the myths of America, but sells him or herself on dealing with the real problems of America, which keep getting brushed under the rug.
Well, Howard, we have about 30 seconds left. What would you like to leave folks with, a final thought perhaps about these monuments, or if you haven't seen them, where should they start to go to?
If you want to see monuments, there's no place to go like Gettysburg. But when you look at the monuments, look hard at what the different states are saying about the men who fought on those battlefields, and look for beauty. Look for beauty in the stonework, and also look for excess, because America went a little overboard at Gettysburg, and even if you're walking in the backwoods parts of the battlefield today, you can even trip on forgotten monuments. There's a few too many of them. We can overdo it.
All right. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for
having me, Judy.
That's our program for today. I'm Judy Simpson. We'll see you again next time on Across the Fence.
Additional funding for Mr. Coffin's work for this program was provided by National Life Group.